cède la parole. Et la présentation sera en anglais. Questions-réponses fort probablement en anglais. Mais je sais que Mary parle d'autres langues que l'anglais. Et donc, du coup, si vous avez une envie de partager dans différentes langues, je pense que c'est possible. Up to you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Philippe, for inviting me here. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to get to meet you and to get to share a bit about the work that I've been working on really for the last decade. And I'll apologize in advance for my terrible French. I'm very embarrassed of this. And I was actually in a taxi on the way here. And the driver, it turns out, I was trying to navigate, telling him where I was going on the university's campus in terrible broken French. And then I realized that he had a little thing hanging from his rear view mirror from Bosnia. And it turned out that he was from Bosnia and a refugee here from the war, which I was grateful for because my Bosnian is quite a bit better than my French. So I was able to make it here and navigate the campus in Bosnian, which was a bit more effective. So I want to talk to you about the work that has recently been published in a book with the title of War, Women in Power. But it's also a broader project that is also kind of setting up the work that I'm pursuing now going forward. And so I'll talk first today about the book project and about the research that I've been doing for the last decade, but also turn to the project that work inspired, and really would invite and welcome any feedback or suggestions at any point regarding that new project. So in 1994, at the beginning of the year, a woman named Ignatine Nyirakundo was a housewife living in the south of Rwanda. When the genocide broke out, her husband, her parents, and many members of her family were killed. And she found herself alone. She described it to me in an interview. To move forward in the aftermath of the violence wasn't a choice. It was an obligation. Either you do it or you die. Either you provide for yourself, for your children, or others, or you die. Instead of dwelling on her losses, Ignatine began to focus her energy on helping children in her community. She managed to go back to school. She eventually found a job with UNICEF and began working more formally on vulnerable children. Soon, she decided that she wanted to make a bigger impact and ran for office. Her first campaign was successful, and today, Ignatine sits in Rwanda's parliament, which boasts the highest level of women legislators of any country in the world. In Bosnia, a woman named Kada was a factory employee when the war broke out. During the bloodshed, she became separated from her family. She had so many questions. Where are the people we love? Are they imprisoned? Are they alive? Telling me we did not have a lot of answers. As the war came to an end, she realized that her worst fears were likely true. Both her husband and her son had been killed. She joined together with others in the region to help petition local authorities to help find the graves where they had been buried. Believing, as she put it to me, that protests were the only way to be heard, she began to organize with other women. Soon, she'd organized one of the largest and most active groups of women who used their shared grief to demand that politicians reveal the location of their loved ones' bodies. Another member of this group described to me how at the beginning of the war we were just housewives raising our kids, and our husbands were in charge of providing food for us. But today, she said, every powerful person that comes to Bosnia wants to talk to us. These stories, and dozens more like them, complicate narratives depicting women as merely the victims and the spoils of war. And so I wrote this book in an attempt to explore and really to better theorize how women like Ignatine and Kada experience war, bear witness to its effects, and exert agency and power in ways oftentimes obscured by more traditional scholarship on women in war, as well as by journalistic coverage of women in war. So this book begins with the obvious. War is destructive. It devastates societies, it ruins lives, ruptures economic systems, lays waste to infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And much of the coverage of women in war has typically featured women as particularly harmed or particularly vulnerable. Images of women weeping or wringing hands, often positioned as victims of sexual violence, of homelessness, of displacement, of abuse. These images abound. Yet recent research has revealed something surprising. Countries that have experienced war across the globe have higher levels of women in their legislatures than countries that have not experienced violence. This is literature by work by Melanie Hughes, a sociologist, by Eileen Tripp, a political scientist, and they show empirically that in post-war cases, there's an uptick of women in formal legislative positions. So this actually is relatively this idea that war is not only a period of destruction, but is also a period of transformation, motivates this book. So the overarching question that I explore is how mass violence can impact societies, and more specifically, how it can impact women. There's been a long, kind of lengthy tradition in historical sociology, political science, economics, looking at the transformative impact of war. A lot of this is focused on individuals, such as on increased political participation or conditioning of voting behavior in the aftermath. And of course, there's been another set of literature really looking at war's impact on institutions, on structures, on how it makes states, in Tilley's words, how it can lead to collective action and new social networks, in Libby Wood's words, and how interstate war in particular is a necessary condition for particular forms of domestic revolutions. We can talk about this literature more if anyone's interested, but I'll sort of gloss over it now. There's also a literature on the gendered impact of war violence, of course. This literature focuses primarily on the differential effects that that war has on differently gendered individuals. And in much of this literature, the focus has been on women as combatants, or as women as peaceful protesters resisting war. A more kind of recent strand of literature has oftentimes looked at, or has also looked at, how more revolutionary wars can sometimes restructure gendered hierarchies as women take on new roles. Jocelyn Paterna's book, for instance, on the FMLN in El Salvador, Women in War, came out a few years ago, really looks at how, as a result of women's participation in the armed struggle, they were able to make claims and participate in the political apparatus of the FMLN in ways that were previously infeasible. But in much of this literature, the focus at the end of the day is on how any sort of shifts or gains that women may make during a period of war oftentimes get set back in the aftermath. So in this book project, I began with the case of Rwanda. I began investigating stories like Ignatine's that really began to complicate this idea of women as merely disadvantaged and suffering as a result of violence, although they are certainly that. So just a kind of quick overview of the war in Rwanda. Violence began in 1990. It escalated in a genocide in 1994. Estimates of the death toll are highly politicized, but best estimates are around about 800,000 people dead during this period of violence. About 4 million people, which is half the population, displaced. Half of that group internally displaced, and another half of that externally displaced in neighboring countries like DR Congo or Burundi and Tanzania. What's remarkable about the Rwanda story is the recovery. And since 1994, Rwanda has been at the forefront of narratives around kind of resilience and rebuilding in the aftermath of mass conflict. The leadership of the state has put forth really remarkable and comprehensive economic reforms, including things like full-scale agricultural restructuring. There has been a complete set of political reforms that have led to the inclusion of women and gender-sensitive language at all levels of government, from a political quota in the national parliament that trickles all the way down all the other sort of apparatuses of the political system. Today, there are more girls than boys in primary school. As I mentioned before, it has the world's highest percentage of women in parliament, and a set of gender-sensitive laws and institutions that have granted women traditionally rights that were traditionally reserved for men, such as inheritance, such as access to kind of own property, to open bank accounts, and so forth. The second case that I look at in this project is Bosnia. And the primary logic for the comparison is really about the timing of the violence. The timing of the war in Bosnia happened around the same time as the war and genocide in Rwanda. Between 1992 and 1995, as part of the disintegration and dissolution of former Yugoslavia, Bosnia declared its independence and a war broke out. The war had multiple axes and facets to it. But between 1992 and 1995, best estimates are that about 100,000 people were killed and 2 million people were displaced, which again is approximately 50% of the population. So that's another kind of point of comparison between the two cases. The picture for Bosnia, however, looks remarkably different than the picture for Rwanda since the violence. After the Dayton Accords, we see a tremendous amount of government dysfunction, political dysfunction, and economic stagnation, which has resulted in, or I should say the Dayton Accords resulted in a consociational political system which divided the state into two entities with varying levels of control over different parts of the government. Gains for women have been recognized in formal law and in policies, but many of these have failed to trickle down to the local level. And there's been, especially in recent years, a high level of out-migration from Bosnia to Western Europe. I'll talk a little bit about, more about the differences between these cases, but this is just sort of an overview to set it up. So for the project, what I was interested in doing was speaking with women about how the war impacted their lives. And I had the tremendous privilege to sit down with more than 260 women across both cases throughout the course of this research. These women were farmers, they were house girls, they were market vendors, sex workers, lawyers, retirees, factory supervisors, NGO workers, activists, mayors, ministers, and members of parliament. And I asked them about how the war shaped their lives. I also conducted participant observation with women's groups and examined a whole host of documents from both governments and also from NGOs, and kind of can talk more about the methods behind the study if that's of interest to anybody. These interviews resulted in just tremendous stories like the ones I started off with today. One Rwandan woman lamented how after losing her husband, just survival at home is another hassle, she said. It's like you become a father and a mother. So you get all of the man's responsibilities as well as the woman's responsibilities. If the roof is blown off because it was blown off by the wind, that should not have been me, it should have been him. You can imagine, and now it's all my responsibility. They also talked about the pain of losing family members, husbands, children. I described this yesterday in Philippe's class, but I sat in one Bosnian woman's house for many afternoons as she's described how the agony of searching for her son's remains, which she still hasn't found. At any word that a grave has been found anywhere in Bosnia, she quite literally runs to the location, drops to her knees, and begins to dig through the dirt with her hands. She describes to me how each time she has done this, she was so hopeful that she would find him. These narratives, these stories, led to the central argument of the book, which is really that war precipitates three major intersecting and overlapping shifts that have facilitated the increased mobilization of women in both Rwanda and Bosnia. The first shift, which might kind of be apparent already, is in the demographic composition of society due to the disproportionate death, conscription, and imprisonment of men, as well as the massive displacement of people from their homes. And what I argue is that this shift led to the creation of new social networks, as displacement forced people into new routines and modes of social interaction, and the absence of men put traditional gender roles within the household in flux. The second shift was economic, triggered by the macroeconomic collapse during war in both contexts, and exacerbated by the corresponding destruction of infrastructure, but also agricultural capacity, which is key in both cases. This shift led to urgent material needs among the population for food, for water, for shelter, for medical care, for education. And I argue that these urgent needs catalyzed the formation of thousands of informal self-help groups, which really met to actually meet these urgent needs. These community organizations formalized and institutionalized a system of women's leadership at the grassroots level and helped women develop self-resilience, encouraged profit-making activities, and facilitated a shift in how women controlled surplus income. A third shift was cultural. In both cases, women participated, as women's participation, I should say, in community organizations and in public spaces became increasingly common. Cultural understandings of who constituted a legitimate public actor shifted. And this was largely because women juxtaposed themselves to men as more peaceful, as those who were less responsible for the violence, as ones that could say boldly and in front of many people, this was not our war. This is particularly salient in the aftermath of the war in genocide, or the war in Rwanda, where the ruling elite, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, delegitimized the violence and made anyone who perpetrated in the violence seen as a genocidaire, as somebody culpable of genocide, right? And so women who tended to participate in the violence at lower levels than men were able to say, that's not us. We are a less kind of ethnic, less politically contested constituency, which deserves a voice in this peace kind of transition phase. In Bosnia, the same thing. This public support for the war in Bosnia was minuscule during the war. And so this delegitimization, not among everybody, of course, but among many people, and the delegitimization of the war as something that was legitimate really amplified in the aftermath. And so women were able to really create some distance between themselves and the political logic and the political elites that continue to run the government. So the key kind of theoretical contribution of the book is this idea of beginning to push our thinking around what constitutes political behavior, political action, and political mobilization outside of formal institutions and into the day-to-day activities that women in particular are more likely to engage in contexts where there is a kind of repression or contexts where there's mass destabilization. So I talk about this in terms of the quiet encroachment of the ordinary, the idea that the ordinary sort of behaviors of a subaltern or marginalized population that don't necessarily look political. It can look like making sure that everybody gets their roofs rebuilt. It can look like making sure that there is a clean water source in the area for children. It can look like things that are not at face value political, but these things can begin to accumulate. And that accumulation is key. So what I argue is that war, through these three interrelated and overlapping shifts, demographic shifts, economic shifts, and cultural shifts, can precipitate this increased level of women's participation in informal political activities. And here I draw on scholars here like James Scott, like Louise Tilley, like Laila Abu-Lughod, and in particular draw on the framework put forth by Asif Bayat, who talks about the collective actions of not collective actors, can look like a politics of practice rather than of protest, but that these actions are political nonetheless, and that they can accumulate. This is really the kind of at the core of the theoretical contribution of the book. So just to go through these shifts in just a few minutes. The first one is this demographic shift that I mentioned, and this occurs through mass displacement, emigration, and in the Rwanda case, immigration during the immediate aftermath of the violence, where about 1 million Tutsi refugees that had grown up in exile outside of Rwanda returned to the country in the aftermath. The other kind of demographic effect here is this disproportionate death, displacement, and imprisonment of men. In Rwanda, men constituted 56% of the dead, but were much more likely to be thrown in prison in the aftermath of the conflict. In Bosnia, men comprised 90% of the dead and were also much more likely to be displaced from their homes in a regional army that weren't demobilized for several years. And what I argue is that these two shifts basically lead to the formation of these grassroots self-help organizations and also catalyze a shift in the way in which women have power within their own households. One of the things you can look at is actually shifts in the sex ratio that are the way that when I first started talking about this project, one of the comments and questions I would get all the time was, well, women took on leadership roles, isn't it just because all the men died? And I really resist this, as an explanation of anything really. But I do think that there's something around the idea of men's displacement from the home that leads to things like women having control over cash for the first time, especially in Rwanda, making decisions about how surplus cash is used because of their husband's absence from the home. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And so you can dive into the numbers in terms of what areas of the country had larger or smaller shifts in these demographic ratios. And we can actually see, although it hasn't been systematically analyzed, that women have taken on more leadership roles in areas that had higher levels of men killed or displaced. So this is just, to kind of really emphasize the tremendous burden that was placed on women who became the heads of their households in the aftermath of violence. A woman named Jeanette says, she describes how life changed totally after her husband was dead. Because there was 10 of us in my family and only 3 survived. All of the kids of my brothers and sisters, they all came to my home. Everybody was in my home. Even the kids of the neighborhood, they didn't know anyone else, so I was like their mom. I can't imagine how we survived, right? One of the things I think it's important to note is that this kind of increased power that women oftentimes took on, especially in women-led households, was not celebrated, right? This was a tremendous burden. This was extremely difficult for so many in these positions to take on all of the new roles and responsibilities that were required to simply maintain the kind of health and life of those in their family. To quickly go shift to economic shifts. Again, the idea that mass violence creates this destruction of infrastructure and agricultural capacity, but then leads then to this urgent need for food, water, healthcare, and so forth. And what this does is it shifts women's caregiving responsibilities from within the home to outside the home. It requires them oftentimes to go and seek aid and resources from international humanitarian agencies, from local government that might be handing out resources. And as a result of this arrival of international humanitarian kind of aid and attention, there's this incentive to begin to form grassroots organizations at the community level that can then appeal to those humanitarian agencies for support. So sometimes these grassroots agencies were formed around things as basic initially as a grieving circle, right? Or simply a group of neighbors that were looking for how to help the neighbor that was the poorest off actually rebuild and resecure their home. But with the arrival of these humanitarian actors, women began to realize that if they formalized and created a community organization with a name, elected a president, maybe a vice president, created a mission statement, they could actually go to one of these humanitarian agencies and say, look, our organization is delivering roofing for people in our community. And what I argue that this did is that it formalized a system of women's leadership at the very local level. Things that initially, issues that were initially kind of very non-political, issues related to basic survival, began to actually kind of serve as a blueprint for this idea that certain women could speak on behalf of other women in their community. And you could look at the scale of this economic need just through a couple basic statistics. Just kind of an aggregate statistic in Rwanda, this massive drop in GDP from 1991 at 2 billion to 750 million in 1995. In Bosnia, kind of at a per capita level, a reduction in GDP per capita to 20% what it was during the war. And so these basic sort of, just kind of uncontextualized statistics, just designed to give a bit of context in terms of kind of the scale of need. The scale of need, and then the scale of the scale of the economy that was really absent and unable to provide many of the kind of critical material needs that people require to carry on. And so the key here is this shift from caregiving roles from inside the home to outside the home. This kind of quote, just again to illustrate this shift, a woman who eventually became a mayor but who was a widow during the genocide, talked about how the first activity in their community was simply to help those who were sick. Right? This started as humanitarian, immediate sort of attention. In the beginning, when we first started to organize ourselves, we were immediately needed on an emergency level to help. And so there was emergency relief. But then it begins to shift. This organization that she's working with begins to try to reunite families together, mothers and children. Those were our first activities. And she goes on in this interview to really talk about how this organization then became kind of the primary service provider in that area, that then allowed people that were in leadership positions within that organization to become involved with local government as government became more kind of reestablished. And finally is the cultural shifts, right? This idea that because of the way in which men can be, there's this essentialized gendered understanding of men as more culpable for war, women were able to strategically frame themselves as more peaceful. And I think this is an interesting one because in some ways there was this strategic essentialization of gender roles and notions of femininity and notions of women as more peaceful than men in a very deliberate way by a lot of women activists and women's rights champions who basically said, this was not our war. We were not responsible for war, so you better give us a seat at the table, kind of. And the other way that this played out is that as a result of women's kind of perceived less culpability in the war, in some contexts, they were able to cross ethnic lines and engage in kind of cross kind of divided cities and move in and out of entities and so forth in ways that men who were seen as more suspicious were not. So I'll just add that in the Rwanda case, what becomes very interesting is that the ruling regime, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, capitalizes on this narrative of women as more peaceful than men and uses it to actually push women into political office. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. So just to summarize the overarching argument of really the kind of framework that I'm putting forth in this book, is that mass violence leads to demographic, economic, and cultural shifts, which then leads to women's increased participation in informal political activities. Political activities defined broadly through this idea of the politics of practice. With gender-sensitive regime change in Rwanda, we see the inclusion of women into formal political roles, such as in parliament and in local kind of government offices. But what's key to note is that the inclusion of women in the Rwandan Patriotic Front's agenda really had a lot to do with its desire and need to justify and legitimize its own political control. The RPF, for those who are familiar with it, is an ethnic minority ruling regime with its origins in Anglophone Uganda. And when it returned to Rwanda, it really needed to justify its control to the majority of the population who were naturally extremely suspicious of this regime. And thus women became, in some ways, a political tool for the regime to put forth, to sort of market the regime as a less ethnic, kind of less politicized regime that was not concerned with politics but was concerned with development. And it also served to get the regime many accolades from the international community. So I can talk more about that if it's useful or interesting to anybody, but I think it's an important caveat to the story of women's political leadership in Rwanda. What did this look like in terms of women's informal political participation? The most visible manifestation of women's informal political mobilization was in the formation of the mushrooming, if you will, of informal community organizations. An estimated 15,000 women's organizations formed across Rwanda in the first few years in the aftermath of the genocide. And I talk in the book about how there was a process of institutional isomorphism, if you will, where these small grassroots organizations mimicked the structure of international organizations and more formal NGOs. And so that this, again, led to that emergence of kind of formal leadership positions for women at the grassroots. This is a similar process happened in Bosnia, but to a smaller extent. An estimated 1,500 women's organizations emerged in the aftermath of the violence. Many of these organizations to do things like these women are doing, which is kind of replanting land that has gone fallow, providing psychosocial support to people in need, helping to reunite families, and so forth. This quote from a woman who's now a judge in Bosnia really tries to get at kind of the political nature of this process. She says, women from villages and towns, they became really proactive after the war and engaged in those civil society organizations. Before the war, there were a lot of women who did not even think about engaging in society, but I also think these unfortunate circumstances of war were a catalyst for them being politically engaged. And this sort of echoes this in Rwanda, my favorite quote. She says, before the genocide, politics was considered a male domain. It was like their personal bedroom where nobody can go in. And after the war, this changed. So when I was writing up this all of these interviews, I revisited Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark, which maybe some of you have read. She wrote it after the U.S. launched its war in Iraq in the early 2000s. And she said something that stuck with me in this book. She said, inside the word emergency is emerge. From an emergency, new things come forth. The old certainties are crumbling fast, but danger and possibility are sisters. And it's this focus on emergence, this focus on creativity, on resilience, and on the unexpected ways that war can open space for women and for humans more broadly, that to upend traditional forms of power and to take on new political roles. It is this focus on emergence that I hope people take away from this book. But, unfortunately, the story in both of these cases is not nearly as clear in the end. I show how much of this mobilization of women in the immediate aftermath of the wars in both places was unfortunately, and in some ways very tragically, set back as the years passed. And in the book, I theorize this process of barriers to women's continued mobilization through three overarching things. What I call a revitalization of patriarchy, the post-violence political settlement, which entrenched hierarchies of victimhood, and the arrival of international actors, who again, in the process of giving aid, managed to, in some cases, fracture and unintentionally set back many of the gains women had made. So I won't get into all of these today, but I will speak briefly about this idea of political settlements creating hierarchies of victimhood. So in the political settlement in both cases is very different. In Bosnia, you have an internationally orchestrated peace agreement at Dayton that divides the country into two entities, the Republika Srpska with approximately 49% of the land, and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina with 51% of the land. There's a rotating presidency with 3 different presidents, as well as presidents from each of the respective entities. And there's another district called Brčko up here, which adds another twist to the whole kind of complicated governance structure. And as a result, many of the laws that were implemented that pertained to women, and particularly women who had experienced forms of, say, sexual violence, were very different between these two entities. For instance, to be able to receive a pension as a civilian victim of war, which a woman who had been raped or subjected to sexual torture during the war, in theory, would be able to do. Within the Republika Srpska, one had to show that you had 60% bodily damage to receive this type of pension. This is not something that many survivors of sexual violence can show. right? The wounds are psychological, they are trauma, they are not necessarily visible on one's body. In the Federation this rule of 60% bodily damage was not enforced and not required. And so women who were survivors of sexual violence were actually able to access resources and psychosocial healing and small pensions to be able to support their healing and their recovery in the aftermath of the war. This is one of many kind of differences between these two entities. In the RPF case, this conflict is ended through a military victory, where the rebel army of the Rwandan Patriotic Front takes control of the state and immediately eliminates many forms of any form of political opposition, runs the entire former regime into exile, and rules with an iron fist to this day, although especially in the immediate aftermath of the violence. And what the RPF did is create a narrative of the violence that basically positioned Tutsi victims as the only real victims of the genocide. And anyone else that had suffered from the war or from the kind of instability and insecurity more broadly was not deemed to be deserving of a victim status. And victim status in both cases allows people to access resources. So being a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda actually grants you a right to a home, grants you a pension, gets your kids into school for free, but only Tutsis could be designated survivors. Hutus, maybe who were married to Tutsis, who had their husbands killed or their wives killed because they were Tutsi, were not eligible for any of these services, and this kind of the division between legitimate victims and whose life is considered, whose suffering is considered grievable, is very salient in both of these cases. And what I argue it did is create a hierarchy of victimhood, which allows, which privileges the experience of some over others. I'll give you a very visual representation of one of the ways this hierarchy works. I'm not sure you can see this very well, but the war in Bosnia resulted in the massacre at Srebrenica being determined or declared to be an episode of genocide by the International Court, or by the International Court of Justice and the ICTY. And even in subsequent rulings at the ICTY, like the one that came down last year from Karadzic, there was he was convicted of genocide in Srebrenica, but he was acquitted of genocide in all other parts of the country. And what this has done is it creates another sort of hierarchy here, where the suffering of people in Srebrenica is seen, it's made visible, and it's grieved by international communities. Every year at the kind of commemoration, there's a memorial site that's a very well curated memorial. It's visited by dignitaries like Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright every year. Whereas on the other side of the country, in the Krajina region, there's a different politics of memory that unfolds. And so this is a picture of Ternopilje that I took, I think, in 2013. Ternopilje was one of the transit camps in the Krajina region where many people were rounded up and pushed kind of through this camp. Some people were killed there. It was primarily a transit camp. And if you go to Krajina today, or if you go to, Ternopilje today, or if you go to Omarska or any of the other camps that exist in that region, there's not even a notation. There's not even a sign commemorating what happened at this place. There's even in the front of Ternopilje a memorial to Serb soldiers that were killed, rather than to any of the non-Serbs that passed through here in a way that was extremely brutal. And so this just again is to show kind of the way in which these hierarchies formed. What I argue is that they fractured much of the organizing that women were doing in the aftermath of the war. Women who were from the Krajina region became resentful of women from the Srebrenica region who were getting more international attention, who were getting more donations, and they felt like their victimhood and their suffering had not been acknowledged. The same thing goes within ethnic groups. The elevation of rape survivors, of widows, over people that had other experiences of violence was profound. And it served to fracture, again, these organizations that formed more about geographic location, proximity to each other, rather than about experience during the violence. And so you hear people repeatedly saying things like this. Medina, who was a woman who was, she was at Srebrenica when the enclave was cleared, but she survived, as did her husband, and she was the victim of a shrapnel attack, a bomb. She had scars and wounds on her body. She says she was in an organization that had knitting circles, and they would pay us and give us a bus ticket, and most of the women who were coming there were victims of sexual violence. But I'm not. And we asked if we were going to get paid for anything they were producing, and the woman said that I wouldn't because I wasn't a victim of sexual violence. I was then excluded from the circle. So groups realized that they were able to better position themselves for international funding if they were able to actually coalesce around a single narrative and elevate a victim identity that was seen by the international community as one very deserving of aid. And this process results in many of the informal sort of grassroots mobilization. It results in really the kind of demobilization of many of these groups. And I think it draws our discussion to the need to critically examine models of aid and transitional justice, and even women's empowerment projects after war, because sometimes efforts that are designed to remedy women's subordination and actually help women can unintentionally reinforce subordination and create new forms of inequality. So I always come back to Judith Butler here and kind of this question of what makes for a grievable life, and I think that this ultimately is the question that allowed for much of this fracturing to occur in the aftermath of both places. I'm going to skip forward because I want to talk very briefly here about where this is leading. So at the end of this project, I was left with so many questions about how do we do this better? How do we go into post-conflict, post-war places and distribute aid, secure women's political participation in ways that don't end up setting back much of that organic sort of progress that oftentimes emerges during and after war? And so my book, and then a recent book by my colleague or friend Millie Lake, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, began to sort of ask similar questions at the end of both of these books. How do post-war women's empowerment interventions impact women's lives? Who benefits from post-war gender reforms? Which women based on their ethnic identity, their age, their ability, their linguistic background, which women are positioned to be able to take advantage of new rights and gains that women may make during war. And so we've launched this project in 10 countries, which we're calling the RAR Project, the Women's Rights After War Project, but it's more just because it's sort of it's a bad acronym. Or it's a good acronym, I'm not quite sure which. But what we're doing is we're compiling a comprehensive data set on all of the gender reforms that have been implemented in these 10 post-war cases in the areas of criminal justice, family law, and politics. And the 10 case studies are in Congo, Liberia, Rwanda, Uganda, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Bosnia, and Nepal. And what we're presenting as a theoretical framework and really trying to understand and explore whether this holds up is a theory of gendered instrumentalism. The idea that there oftentimes is a political logic behind the implementation of women's empowerment reforms and policies, especially in the aftermath of violence. And we're looking at the difference between women's access to rights and power within cases in terms of differently situated women, but also between cases. And I won't spend any time on this, but really, the hypothesis that we're working on is that patterns of gender instrumentalism will be more visible in conflicts where one faction dominates the post-war political settlement. And this is really based on the Rwanda case, this idea that Tutsi women are able to access rights and resources in ways that other women are not. And then we also have two more hypotheses within states, but I'll kind of skip those to really talk about our goal here with this project, which is an intersectional theory of empowerment. How, where, under what conditions are women from different backgrounds, different ethnic, class, racial, political backgrounds, afforded equal access to cross-cutting and enduring opportunities for advancement after war? How are ownership, power, and control over new rights experienced by differently situated women? And how do women and sexual and gender minorities understand the terms of their own empowerment? And we're embarking on this project both through that data set, that's the very first step, but we're running a series of kind of participatory action, participatory research models in each of the 10 countries, which include photo voice techniques, which is a feminist research methodology, uses cameras, and training around taking pictures of barriers in people's lives, of challenges people face, as well as things they're proud of. So we're trying to innovate and pilot new materials to really, or new methods, I should say, to really get at what is empowerment and what does it mean to differently situated women? When do we know when people have it or feel it? And what are the things that prevent that women in particular and sexual and gender minorities from being able to take advantage of many of the rights that do exist now for women on paper, but so often there's a big gap between what exists on paper in formal spaces and what people experience in their lived and ordinary lives and daily lives. So I'll just leave it there and happily will answer any questions about any of that. And thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.